Time to start. And we are going to be relatively quick through the business section of the meeting. You will find on your chairs the agenda, and I will go through that in quick order. We formally open the 46th annual meeting, and we welcome all of you to this meeting. I would like to quickly introduce the officers and directors present. As officers, my name is Chris Schipper. The other officer here is John Fusick, our treasurer. The directors present are Tom Cronin, John Engel. Please stand. Yes. Ditte Riefsnyder in the corner. Sief de Geyser. Penny Ross. Julia Portal. Judy Dunn. Am I good? Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move to say that with that group of directors, we have quorum. I'm going to move to dispense with the reading of the minutes of the last annual meeting. And I am going to move to the first motion to amend the bylaws of the Articles of Incorporation to increase the board size to 15 members. Do I have that motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to motion to amend the bylaws again to increase the size of the board to 15.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Motion carried. The second motion is to elect 4 new directors. You'll see that on the back of your agenda. Steve, Julia, Ditte, and Penny have all been working with the Land Trust in the past year, but we formally elect them for a 4-year term in this session. So can I have a motion to accept the new directors?
So moved.
So moved. All those in favor? Say aye. Aye. Motion carried. That is the business part of the meeting. Thank you so much for putting up with that. Let's start with the Land Trust. And I always like to start with John Muir, who was one of the original Scotsmen who came over and walked the woods and told the story. Our story is about open space in New Canaan. It is a perpetual journey. I'd like to highlight also that we always mention Jack Gunther, who was the founder of the New Canaan Land Trust in this setting. The movement began during the 60s, part of the environmental or green movement, and it really kicked off with, one of the kickoffs was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where she noted the use of chemicals, particularly DDT, as creating eerily silent mornings. And the question you ask yourself here in New Canaan is, as we further build out properties and clear lots, are we in a situation where we are clearing out timbered lands and creating the look of Silent Spring? That's why the Land Trust exists, which is to create open spaces, wildlife sanctuaries, and continue the scenic beauty of New Canaan. And we need that. We need it for bird habitat, as the birders here well know. But we need it for wildlife habitat, whether it's turkeys, insects, bugs. We need it for biodiversity, not just green lawns. We need it for water filtration. Many of us are on well water, so the quality of filtration is an important aspect for all of us. And we need it for the carbon sequestration, the ability to take in CO2 and create oxygen is pretty important. But all those pictures really refer to the importance of, in a way, scenic beauty, what is good for our souls. The Land Trust movement has been underway for about 50 years, 55 years. There's quite a lot of land under conservation, quite a few organizations. They're almost entirely voluntary. The more mature organizations start to have executive directors and staff. But as you can see, it's a volunteer organization with millions of members. You're not alone in believing in this. And we acquire land and land rights and protect the property by deed restriction in perpetuity. Very few organizations exist in perpetuity. I mean, are actually created to exist in perpetuity. That's the role of the Land Trust, to do this and for us to pass on and on and on this open space. It was founded in 1967 by Jack Gunther, who's a visionary. And for those of you who have been around a long time, it really, I think one of the seminal moments was when the Waveney Park, Ruth Lloyd Lapham, offered the town her beautiful estate, Waveney, at a somewhat bargain price and contributed 50 acres to the high school, that was a seminal moment, and it was that sense of, let's call it noblesse oblige, that really triggered a group of citizens around town to say, what can we do? We can't do it at this level, but we can do things with our acres over 10 or 20 or land that we don't think should be developed. Today, the Land Trust protects and cares for 67 parcels, totaling 365 acres. We receive no town funding. We also don't cost the town anything. We don't send students to school. We don't need sewer systems. We don't have pension plans or health care benefits. So there is a positive, and some people will say we take property off the tax rolls. I would say we are probably a moderating influence on tax rolls. And I say this every time, we stand on the shoulders of giants. If you consider the fact that 365 acres have been given or eased as open space, it's a remarkably great thing. That giving sort of tapered out about 1995, and the question you ask yourself is, have we run out of open space? I don't think so. I think if we look at our neighbors, Darien, Wilton, Greenwich, all of them have added open space in recent years. When I worked with Art Potts to step into his shoes, which I think all you know are big shoes, I came up with a basic diagram of how can we reignite interest in open space. And it was a strategy of raising awareness, building activities, growing membership, and then generating donations. We did simple things like rebranded from the signs that were originally put out in 1967 to a new, more vibrant sign that says, look again at the Land Trust. We also, for the first time in 30 years, 35 years, distributed a map, all of which I think is a copy on each of your chairs, to highlight where all our properties are and to let our neighbors know, hey, we're here too. There are opportunities. A new image, a map. We were successful in developing a website, homegrown. We've done a lot of public engagement, public speaking opportunities, and we are at the moment surveying 133 acres of our holdings. And if that doesn't get your neighbors' awareness when a red stake shows up on their backyard, nothing will. On the activity side, we opened up the Pritchard Brown Sanctuary and the Nancy Watson Symington Woodlands. We have engaged with New Canaan youth, Slavs, Boy Scouts, and Girl Scouts. We completed forestry studies on our two properties, and we've recently agreed to merge with Audubon to help become stewards of their 56 acres and to bring in and welcome birders into the Land Trust environment. Sorry for the quality of this image, but there's a look back in time. There are some of those leading citizens we talked about: Stuart Higley, Elise Lapham, Walter Shaw, Pritchard Brown, Jack Gunther, and Donald O'Brien. And here's from Ed Aberman, a map that was originally drawn on that property. So it was trailed early on. These properties have been made accessible at different points in time. Here's an example of where we brought the youth out of New Canaan. We're delighted. The slobs turn out to be a great workforce if you give them something sharp to play with. If you put them in the woods and they can move big sticks, they turn out to be a pretty good workforce for you. And they reassure me that the big glacial erratic that's on that property is still there. Some of you may have visited the Nancy Watson Symington Woodlands, which is bordered by Wellesley, Greenlee, and West. And we have highlighted the trail that is now put through there, which is a pretty good mix of upland, lowland, woodlands, and has some beautiful, beautiful trees on it, and even a small running waterfall. And with the help of the Scouts, and here you can see George Hurdy, we created an entranceway and a trail, or a head trail, into the trailhead. And finally, I touched base on working with Audubon and working with Dr. Wright here in town to bring that into the fold and add that to the stewardship program. On the membership side, well, and I highlighted those points. As far as membership is concerned, this is important. You know, any organization shares, all organizations share this trait. You have to attract resources to achieve your goals and survive. Without support from the neighbors, without support from the town, we would not survive. And so we have an internal goal or a board goal of getting 600 families to become members of the Land Trust. It should be doable because about 600 homes abut or are across from Land Trust property. So those neighbors of ours really see the benefit of it. And as I say, there are a lot of good causes to support, but fewer in your backyard or just down the road. Why am I hopeful? Because we did an analysis of neighboring towns, Greenwich, Darien, and Wilton, and it suggests that we have more land potential, but more importantly, it shows that from a resourcing or revenue potential, we're somewhere like 20 times smaller than them. And I ask people, is New Canaan that different? Is it really that different? It's not. I think that if we raise awareness and we show people that we do good work, membership and donations will come. So we have goals. Frankly, and I say this out of respect to the 60 families who did contribute land, that we should continue to ask families to contribute land. And whether it's an outright land donation or a conservation easement, I think we set a goal. Our 50th anniversary is 2017 of achieving up to 400 acres of protected open space. So overall, we have a goal. 2017 is an important horizon point for us as we reach our 50th anniversary. And we want you to know that as a land trust, we're pivoting to a more active and engaging role, and we want to hear from you. We want to work with everyone in a neighborly fashion, but we want to get everybody out and walking in the woods. You can't appreciate nature if you don't walk in it. You can't appreciate it from a TV. It's walking in the woods and seeing an unusual tree or a different bird. It doesn't happen sitting at home. That is my quick update on the Land Trust and our programs. I would like to now turn it over to John Fusick, our treasurer, who will give you a quick update on our financials.
Excellent, thanks. Thanks, Chris. I'm the treasurer of the Land Trust. The bad news of my presentation is that it's a little harder to read and not as pretty as Chris is. The good news is it's one page, so we'll be through this relatively quickly. The financial report for the Land Trust is as of the fiscal year ending May 2013. So this is a little bit of history. The fiscal year of the Land Trust runs from June through the end of May. And again, the most recent period is the period ending May 13. We are currently obviously in the fiscal 14, and I'll give you a quick update on how that's going as well. The good news to report is that the Land Trust has a slight positive cash flow this year, $1,400 compared to the last 2 years where we were running slight deficit. We are an extremely lean organization. We have no cars, we have no office, we have a prepaid cell phone, and I think probably our third largest asset is a bucket of pruners that we bought for the slobs that sits in Chris's garage. Our large assets are obviously the land. We've kind of estimated based on the tax rolls that the value of the land is something in the neighborhood of $125 million. We have a $327 million endowment. We view that as kind of a critical asset for the land. Is that what I said? Thank you, John. 320. I wish. Maybe next year. $327,000. We think it's important to maintain that and grow that, endowment. We'd certainly, encourage, large gifts to our endowment, but we also intend to take going forward at a minimum 10% of our receipts to help grow the endowment. So make sure that we're, in no case deficit spending, and kind of can make the representation to anyone giving $100 that $10 of that is going to go to grow the endowment. So from just a quick line item perspective, the revenues for fiscal 13 were up over 100% to $17,000. from an expense perspective, 3 of those line items are very fixed. Our insurance, our printing and mailing is for the brochure that everyone got in the mail a few months ago, and telephone. The other slightly variable expenses are our land maintenance, as well as our miscellaneous expenses. The land maintenance is the work that gets done on the land trust property. This was the year that Sandy hit, so that's a big step up, largely related to expenses that we had from Sandy. So if a tree falls and is kind of precariously perched next to a neighbor's property, that needs to be taken care of. We try and get the neighbor to handle that cost. We've had great success in doing that, but there are some expenses that the land trust needs to bear. So end of the day, had a $1,400 positive cash flow and a slight build of the endowment. Let's see. So that's fiscal 2013. From a current year perspective, I'm happy to report that receipts have grown again from a variety of reasons, not the least of which is greater visibility, I think, of the land trust. We're running up about 100% on donations, so the year's not over, but that 17,000 looks like it's running at about 17,000 looks like it's running at 34,000. Correct me if I say million. 34,000 run rate, and our expenses, that has allowed us to do a little bit more with with some of the miscellaneous and the trailheads and things like that Chris mentioned. We have also received a $15,000 grant from the New Canaan Community Foundation that we were able to use to do the survey of our larger properties, and so that was a wonderful gift, and gave us a better handle on that property. So I think the bottom line is that we're really efficient organization. I think we are anyway. We're cash flow positive. We're looking to grow the endowment. With that, I'm going to stop the financial report. Normally we take questions, but since we have a guest speaker tonight, I'm going to ask that we hold those to the end, get right to Todd's presentation. I am the pleasure of introducing Todd, appropriately named Todd Forrest. Todd is the Arthur Ross Vice President at the New York Botanical Garden. He's responsible for all gardens, growth, and exhibitions at the Botanical Gardens. Graduate of Yale University, he's led us on a nature walk through a couple of our properties here. I believe he's a resident of Reading, is that correct? Ridgefield. And, excuse me, and has a wonderful book in the back that you should all take a look at. So without any further ado, Todd.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my first test is the technology situation. Hopefully I pass. And let's go there. And we'll go there. Voila. Yeah, well done, right? Again, enormously self-sufficient. Well, thank you guys so much for having me here on an oddly warm and rainy January evening. I am a neighbor. I live in Ridgefield. And I had the good fortune of spending about an hour last year walking through the Symington Preserve with Chris, and had a fantastic time, and was amazed, actually. That really is a beautiful bit of land, and I, living just around the corner in Ridgefield, didn't realize that there was such a beautiful kind of mature forest, very intact, so close to me. And I love the perspective from John Muir, who was a crotchety old Scot, if there ever was one. It's true. There's something about nature that doesn't just provide ecosystem services, which is what everyone is trying to quantify now. Having a connection with nature is great for the soul and great for the spirit. And providing the opportunity for people to have a connection with nature is an incredibly important and valuable thing to do. And that's what we do at the New York Botanical Garden. For those who has not been to the garden, oh, this is a good crowd. I like this crowd already. I like this crowd. One person, it's okay. You can admit it now because, well, for those of you who haven't been to the garden, it is in really more or less the north central Bronx, northeast of Yankee Stadium. It is a part of the greenest borough in New York City. Most of you don't realize that the borough of the Bronx has about 4,000 acres of open space and parkland. Pretty remarkable. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and how the garden fits into that. The garden as an institution was established in 1891 by an act of the state legislature of New York. It was modeled after the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and that's the famous palm house there in the middle at Kew. And those attractive and happy-looking people on either side are Nathaniel Britton, the founding director of the garden, who was a botanist from Columbia University and a geologist, kind of a nature boy, as it were, and his wife, Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton, who was herself an expert on mosses, and you'll learn a little bit further down the road, one of the early advocates for preserving wildflowers. So the garden was established to pursue a three-part mission, just like Kew, of botanical science. And most people who have been to visit the garden probably don't realize that the largest portion of our staff and of our annual budget goes to our science program. We have about 40 PhD scientists on staff who are generally either systematic botanists, which mean they study the evolutionary relationships between plants, floristic botanists, which mean they study the plants of a given region, whether it's northeastern North America or the Amazon basin or the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil or Palau in Micronesia. And they study molecular systematics and genomics. We have the largest public education program of any botanical garden in the world. We also have programs that serve about 90,000 New York City school children each year. And we have an incredible array of drop-in programs for families and for adults. We have a school of professional horticulture where between 10 and 12 students each year from around the world come and work alongside our gardeners to learn how to become the best gardeners they can become. Education and science are two of the pillars of the institution. And of course, there's horticulture. And I am responsible for horticulture. As such, I have a 250-acre National Historic Landmark landscape that every day I get to spend some time in, which is one of the great joys of my job. It's got great gardens, 50 gardens, collections, and displays, including the Ely Conservatory, pictured here, the largest Victorian-era conservatory in North America, about an acre under glass, designed and built by the Lord and Burnham company. It was completed in 1902. The conservatory is home to our program of changing seasonal exhibitions. This was our Monet show a few years ago. Every year we do between 3 and 5 changing exhibitions. And of course it's also home to our permanent tropical collections, which include many plants collected by our scientists and their work around the world. Who here saw the Monet exhibition? Oh, relatively few. So you've been to the garden, but you don't go often enough, this crowd. Well, we'll try to change that. Of course, we've got incredible design gardens around the New York Botanical Garden, including the Peggy Rockefeller Rose Garden, which was designed by the great American landscape architect Beatrix Farrant in 1916, but not completed until late 1980s when David Rockefeller gave the completion of the garden, which had only been partially constructed, as a gift to his wife Peggy, but really it was a gift to the rest of us. We have incredible plant collections. When the garden was established in the late 19th century, the goal was to assemble plants from around the world, really to serve the research and education missions of the institution. So our scientists, could compare one pine versus another. So students of horticulture could learn how to grow, 50 different types of tulips or bulbs. So the collections were like museum collections, curated, assembled by professionals, and planted on site in the Bronx. Many of those collections remain today, including here's a wonderful Korean pine in the Arthur and Janet Ross conifer arboretum. Behind it is one of the incredible flowering cherries that was planted in the 1940s. It's really fun to go to a place where we have trees that we planted last spring and trees that my predecessor planted 125 years ago. And of course, we have a singular natural landscape. And what ties the whole garden together is that natural landscape. And I'll spend the rest of my talk talking about the garden's natural landscape, including the 50-acre old-growth Thane family forest, and the native plant garden, which is sort of a distillation or a celebration of nature in kind of a gardening format. There's the Thane family forest. It is indeed an old-growth forest. It's never been cut or cleared. It's 50 acres, which is not large in the scale of the great forests of the Pacific Northwest, but in the middle of New York City, it's a pretty remarkable thing. The forest lies at the heart of the garden's 250-acre National Historic Landmark landscape. Again, it was the reason why the garden was established on its site in the late 19th century. Nathaniel Britton, the founding director, was a botanist, and after the state of New York created the garden, he was charged with raising $250,000. So, Chris, we do the same thing that you have to do. Every year since we were founded, we go out hat in hand and try to find people who are as enthusiastic about our mission as we are. So once he was able to raise the $250,000 from kind of the dignitaries of the cultural institutions of New York City, he was able to choose between one of three spots that were offered to him in the Bronx. Why the Bronx? Because that's where the space was. Manhattan was rapidly filling up, and Queens, it still had some farms in it, but it was very urban. And the Bronx had been newly annexed, or portions of it, to New York City. It had been part of Westchester County. And again, there was lots of really remarkable open space there. So the three spots that he looked at, excuse me, were a portion of what is now Van Cortlandt Park, the present site of what is now the Bronx Zoo, and of course the site that is now the garden. And it was a no-brainer for Britton. He walked the site, and at its heart was this 50-acre forest, which they called the Hemlock Grove, because it was never entirely hemlocks, but it had these soaring stands of majestic old-growth hemlocks. But alongside those hemlocks were great white oaks and sweet gums and tulip trees. Incredible rock outcrops you can see here with the glacial potholes sculpted by glaciers 14,000 years ago. Around that forest were a series of old farms and estates. The land had been owned by the Lorillards, which had in pockets fertile soil. So it seemed like the perfect combination, the perfect setting, the perfect canvas upon which to build an institution that was devoted to inspiring people to love plants and to want to learn more about them. Here's a painting by one of the early Hudson River School painters. His name is William Rickerby Miller. And before the Hudson River School painters moved up along the Hudson River, they'd stop in and around New York City. Many of them lived or had their studios in New York. Some of the earliest Hudson River School painters painted the Bronx River. Here, a scene from, I think this is about the 1880s or maybe the 1870s. And that is the old Lorillard Mill, one of three mills the Lorillard family built on the site. And the site was celebrated in the 19th century as one of the most beautiful areas in and around New York. So this is nature and this is beauty that was recognized and preserved in the early 19th century, and largely due to the Lorillard family, which owned the land from 1792 to 1870. So there are wonderful descriptions of the Lorrillards who both lived and worked on the site. Again, they moved here in 1792, just after the Revolutionary War, when their tobacco, their snuff business, had grown out of its headquarters in Lower Manhattan. And they built the first of three mills on the site and built their mansion overlooking the river and the mill. There's wonderful descriptions of the Lorillard family out in carriages on carriage trails that they had built along old Native American trails in the forest. Maybe a little bit hard to read, but the Lorillards' preservation of this land was recognized as extremely important in the 1880s. Again, they moved in 1870. They moved their home to Tuxedo Park, New York, and their tobacco processing plant to Jersey City. Giant step down, if you ask me. And the land was sort of taken by eminent domain as part of this park building movement. There was a great New York journalist named John Mullally, who wrote a book called New Parks Beyond the Harlem. And he, inspired by the great success of Central Park, the great kind of egalitarian democratic success of Central Park, lobbied hard and loud for the creation of more parkland, of more open space, of more green space around New York City. He recognized really in the middle of the 19th century, in the late 19th century, that great cities need great parks, that great parks must do lots of things. They must serve as locations for recreation, and picnics, and horse riding, but they also must serve as connections to the beauty and mystery of nature. So if you ever have a chance, they might even have it in this library. Find yourself a copy of New Parks Beyond the Harlem, because it's this wonderful combination of kind of overwhelmingly purple prose. It's just poesy like you can't even describe, combined with these very kind of hard-nosed journalistic facts about the value that parkland adds to cities. And he was making an argument against the people who said that this land would be much better served as yet another block of housing or yet another block of light industry or whatever it is that was competing for the space. And in the 19th century, he recognized that great cities, great communities need open space. And so he lobbied for the preservation of that space. And in this purple prose, he describes this one particular landscape that the Bronx River ran through with these craggy ancient rocks and these towering native trees. And it really seemed heavenly to him. It seemed otherworldly to him. And his descriptions are otherworldly. I'll read this, one of the many examples of prose that just doesn't get written anymore. It would be difficult to do justice to the exquisite loveliness of the tract without seeming to exaggerate. For the character of the scenery is so varied that every step is a surprise, and the artist and the wayfaring man might love to linger there. That was describing the land that was going to become the New York Botanical Garden eventually. After it became the New York Botanical Garden, and speaking of the forest in particular, the land was described as the most precious natural possession of the city of New York. It was celebrated, again, in the middle of the 19th century by painters, in the late 19th century by advocates for open space, in the early 20th century by scientists and advocates for getting people better connected to plants and nature. And lastly, in the 1920s, when the Olmsted brothers, who were the sons of Frederick Olmsted, who along with Calvert Vaux designed Central Park, did a master plan for the garden, again, had been established about 30 years before, and gardens need to be looked at regularly and kind of reconceived regularly to make sure that they're doing what they were designed to do and meant to do. So another wonderful report that talks a lot about the best allocation of resources and labor and how to keep the garden interesting and beautiful and appealing. But they were just absolutely swayed by the forest. And what they say is the most notable natural feature of the botanical garden, perhaps as a matter of botany and certainly as a matter of landscape, is the gorge of the Bronx River with its wild growth of hemlocks and associated plants, its picturesque precipitous slopes and ledges, its sense of remoteness and seclusion from the city and most of the works of men. It's the 1920s. Again, these are people who are professional designers who made their living altering landscapes to make them more favorable or more beautiful or more compelling. And they were charmed beyond description by this forest, by this landscape. So this was the old-growth forest. And at that time, what everyone knew who knew anything was that Mother Nature knew best. The best thing to do in a natural landscape was to do nothing. For those of you who are students of ecology, that was the era of the climax ecosystem, when ecosystems were like societies or people in that age, where they were meant to progress from kind of rough, wild things through a series of stages until they reached a climax state or a state of perfection. And it was more complicated than that, but it had that kind of value judgment sense to it. These things are moving in a straight line until they get where they need to be. And once they're where they need to be, all we can do is screw them up. So what they argued very strongly is that there should be a let-alone policy of management in the forests, that we should do nothing, that this wonderful 50-acre swath in the middle of the garden, which by then was surrounded by design gardens and living collections of plants from around the world and great architecture and scientists and labs and surrounded by roads, that we should do nothing because it was natural, it had been created by nature over time, and the only thing we could do is screw it up. And then in the early 1900s, in spite of doing nothing, they started seeing massive changes to the forest. And the first one that was measured and talked about was the arrival of chestnut blight. You've all heard of that, right? So you might not know that it was discovered in the Bronx Zoo. The first place that it was found in eastern North America, where chestnuts were the most important, from an ecological sense, tree, really from southern New England all the way down to Georgia, was discovered in a planting of European, or Asian chestnuts, I'm sorry, in the Bronx Zoo. And it was identified and defined and described by a mycologist, a fungal expert who worked at the New York Botanical Garden. And that was in 1904 that it was discovered. By 1910, all of the chestnuts were basically dead. And the prescription then was to cut them down to prevent the spread. This might sound familiar to those of you who know about emerald ash borer. And so all up and down the eastern seaboard, they were cutting down chestnuts to salvage the wood, which was very useful, and to prevent the spread of the disease, which of course they were basically very unsuccessful. So this natural system that had evolved over 14,000 years or so since the last glaciers had passed away was starting to change in front of their very eyes. Also, there were people in the landscape. And in spite of the best efforts, people were doing things that they probably shouldn't have done. Here's a picture of 410 Jacks in the Pulpit, Erisema, that Elizabeth Gertrude Knight Britton, the wife of the director of the garden and a botanist in her own right, and an early advocate for conservation in her own right, she took these from a group of school children who had dug them out from the forest. And this actually turned a light on in her head. And she had seen this. Remember, she, like me, is there every day. And she sees people, and she wants people to come to this landscape and get connected with nature and the beauty of nature and the complexity of plants. But she also saw that people might not always behave so well. There are almost no Jacks in the Pulpits left. Here's a description, Epigea, another wildflower that was in the forest. This is a letter from the zoo in 1924. It's hard to read, so I'll read it to you. This is a letter from somebody at the zoo, from the director of the zoo, to Mrs. Britton. And it says, "Thank you very much for your letter and for your success in discovering arbutus in our circumpolar regions. Dr. Merkel was surprised and pleased, and he's going to search out the last survivors and see what he can do to protect them. There are numerous practical difficulties in the way of fence protection. It will not do to attract attention to the plants, because if we should do, nothing but a steel bar cage would be adequate to keep off the vandals. However, something must be done, that is clear. Barbed wire would be nice if it were not against the law and very fruitful of damage suits." So again, this trailing arbutus is one of the plants that have been described as one of the unusual wildflowers with a wild population in the forest. And again, people were loving it to death. And that's a wonderful picture, isn't it? A man in kind of period garb. Can you all see him down there? At the base of a massive old growth. That probably is an old growth hemlock. You can see how big and tall those trees were. Well, that's also an indication of a human impact on the health of the forest that had not been foreseen. He had to walk there, right? And he was sitting on the ground. How many of you have ever heard of the term soil compaction? Well, you can imagine this wonderful shady oasis in New York City in the heat of July and August that was free and open to the public. In fact, had trains running near it and you could get to it. Well, lots of people escaped to the forest in the summer to escape the heat. And every single one of them was walking wherever they felt like walking. And to make a very long story short, for a long time, the garden was not allowed to erect fences along the trails, not big fences, but low fences, because it seemed somehow unnatural. Meanwhile, these millions of trampling feet were literally killing the forest. The disturbances to the forest were not always so obvious. Squirrels. You see squirrels, it's natural. Well, we have a paradise for squirrels, and our ratio of squirrels is unbelievable. It's about up to 20 times what you would expect per unit area. And squirrels eat a lot of acorns, a lot of hickory nuts. They do a lot of damage. And that's because there are relatively few predators, although that's changing, thankfully, and because they're pushed into this area as the surrounding areas become more urbanized, and because it was squirrel paradise in terms of food. And those squirrels have had a measurable impact on how the forest has evolved and changed. Heavy metals, something else you don't see, but it has a huge impact. everything that goes up in the air in Manhattan comes down in the air in the rain in the Bronx, right? Just because of the way wind currents happen in the summer, we are in harm's way in terms of the industrial pollutants. Every car, every beat-up old Studebaker that was on leaded gas, for 60 years, whatever it is, that's going into the environment and coming down. And our soils, because we're in the middle of a city, surrounded by a city, have much higher concentrations of heavy metals than a similar forest in a rural area, not even that far away from New York City. More modern problems are things like the hemlock woolly adelgid. So it's hard to read, I apologize, but basically the hemlock woolly adelgid was discovered here and has worked its way out. Here's 1971 is green, 1981 is purple, and so on and so forth. The gray area is where hemlocks live. Remember, the forest was called the Hemlock Grove. It was never 100% hemlocks, but it had lots of grand old hemlocks, like the one you saw that man's sitting beneath. Hemlocks are basically gone from the forest today because of the adelgid, which came over on the winds of Hurricane Gloria in the late 1980s. And then invasive exotic species. Many of them were planted in the garden around the forest. Some came with early settlers. Some have come with birds from other places. Some have come in the wind. But the entire flora of the forest has changed. Again, in ways no one knew what an invasive species was even 30 years ago. And 100 years ago, the concept never even crossed anyone's mind. And there's not just a plant here or a plant there. These are the banks of the Bronx River. That's knotweed. You all know what knotweed is? This is something that might be not as familiar to you. It's called lesser celandine, Ficaria vernus, or Ranunculus ficaria. It's like a buttercup. It is a buttercup. It looks a little bit like marsh marigold if you're a native plant gardener, but it's evil. It has evolved a set of attributes that make it impossible to control. In 1898, because the garden was founded by botanists, they did an initial survey of all the wild plants, the spontaneous plants growing on the grounds. And even then, they made a distinction between native and naturalized. You all know that difference, right? Things that have been here since before colonization and things that have kind of hitched a ride. Recently, we did a study of the flora, the spontaneous flora, and have found huge differences. The spontaneous flowering plant species numbers decreased from 564 to 455. In 1898, when that was first published, it was 82.8% of the flora. Now it's only native species now they're only 58.2%. Exotic species have increased in diversity by almost 100%. And there were 6 species that were listed in 1889 as interesting enough to compel people to want to use this site for the site of a botanical garden, and 5 of them are gone entirely from the site due to the reasons that I've already described. There's also a bigger change. A lot of those are small wildflowers that were small populations to begin with, but the forest itself, of course, is made by trees, and you've already learned about the hemlock woolly adelgid. So this is a measure of importance value, which is an ecological metric. Don't worry about how it's figured out, but just say the higher it is, the more important a species is in an ecosystem, the more abundant, the more dominant. So if you look in 1937 at stems that are greater than or equal to 6 inches diameter at breast height, that's 4.5 feet off the ground, 6 inches in diameter, that's blue in 1937. And the red, pink red, is 2006. So in 1937, oak was abundant. It's much more abundant or important today. In 1937, hemlock was, of course, very abundant. It's almost non-existent. And a little thing called cork tree wasn't even measured in 1937 and is measurable today, or in 2006. That's looking at things that are 6 inches diameter at breast height or larger. What happens if you look at smaller than 5 centimeters, so smaller than basically 2 inches diameter? Oak, not very important. Hemlock, gone. And cork tree shooting through the roof. What are you looking at in this slide right here? You're looking at the future forest. You're looking at what that forest will be in 50 years or 100 years, because these are the little things that are coming along. Cork tree, again, is not on like the most wanted lists for anybody, but like lesser celandine, it is a nasty and evil invasive exotic species. No, cork tree is Philodendron amurense. You're thinking of burning bush, Euonymus elatus. Ironically, we don't have a lot of that in the forest because our soils are undisturbed. The two most common invasive shrubs that I see as I zip through your lovely town on the way to my not quite as lovely town are burning bush and barberry, and they're all over the place up here. They're not a problem in our forest. All the land around here basically was farmed not that long ago, and the soil profile here is mechanically disturbed in a way that the soil profile is not disturbed in the forest. And that's why, because it's truly an old-growth forest, it's had a closed canopy with gaps for forever. And that's why those species, I think, aren't the problem there, they are up here. So, it's a grim tale, but it doesn't have an unhappy ending. So the start to sort of fixing things, or moving in the right direction at least, is understanding the problem. So I just described the problem. And to sort of summarize, this was a remarkable landscape, celebrated in the 19th century by painters and poets and muckraking journalists and botanists. It was prescribed to be left alone because it was in a state of perfection. Clearly, that perfection receded quickly, largely due to human influences, anthropogenic problems. Those influences, which seemed subtle at first, upon being measured, seem almost overwhelming. So we reached a decision point. What do we do? We knew if we did nothing, like my predecessors had suggested, that the forest was going to go the way of cork tree and not the way of oak. We had the data. We knew if we did nothing, all of these unintended human influences, the heavy metals, the soil compaction, the invasive species, would overwhelm and they'd win because we saw this happening over time. So basically the idea was that doing nothing was actually allowing us to destroy the forest. So we decided that we had to set about restoring the forest, not to create some Disney-fied perfect forest of our imagination, but the idea was to try to allow the natural processes that had created the forest originally a chance to win out over these unnatural or anthropogenic processes, right? So I don't care if it's oaks, black birch, black cherry, trillium, or Christmas fern. As long as I am able to do a little bit of manipulation and I have a self-sustaining, self-regenerating community of native plants that supports community of native animals and insects, I'm happy. So that's the goal. So what do you do if you want that? You get a Bronx Gothic scene going on, and you hire people who are willing to give of their time and of their lower backs to start hacking away and doing stuff. A lot of mechanical removal of invasive species. Some mechanical removal took equipment not quite so quaint as a hoe and a weed wrench. The cork trees that I described, which had been planted in the garden in the 19th century, are the perfect invasive. They're bird dispersed. They're both shade and sun tolerant. They're drought tolerant. They have not a single natural predator. They're long-lived, and they were just radiating in the natural areas from the point closest to where they had been planted. And you saw that the future was going to be cork tree, so we made the decision to remove the cork trees. And we've removed about 800 of them so far, including some monsters that are 90 years old. In a different lecture, a different time, we can talk about some alternative views to this, but we knew that if we didn't get rid of that seed source, that it was going to be a forest of cork tree eventually. Maybe it will still be a forest of cork tree, but at least we've tried to do something to turn that back. It's hard to sort of make out, except you see lots of people weeding. You cut the big cork trees down, and what do you create? Canopy gaps, which is fine. It's part of the forest process. More sun, and what happens? All the cork tree seedlings, it was like cork tree sod. It was amazing. It was, the entire forest floor was carpeted by these little mini cork tree seedlings. And really, because I don't want to go in there and spray lots of Roundup or rodeo, and I have students and volunteers who work for cheap or free, we got them in to pull them. But once you do that, if you leave that space, nature abhors a vacuum, more cork tree or knotweed or something else likely is going to come back in its place. So we've also started a program of planting. What we've done is we've collected seed from both woody plants and herbaceous plants in the forest, grown that seed on. Why? Because if we just allowed these things to go in and weeded, what we found is the squirrels and the white-footed mice, they're eating a lot of the things that would be kind of competing with the invasives for that growing space. So we're giving these things a leg up. And we're planting them at high density. So here you see how we collect our very low-tech way of collecting acorns. Just big tarps spread across there. It's great. It's kind of interactive. Visitors love to see it. And then we plant tens of thousands of seedlings and saplings and plugs of herbaceous plants, almost entirely grown from seed collected in and around the forest. So the most local native plants imaginable. And we're starting to try to fill in the growing space to prevent these invasives from becoming reestablished. We also recognize that the forest is not nature separate from people. Our forest has a job to do. It's there to serve people. It's there to make people inspired by nature. It's there to teach people about plants or animals, whatever it is. It's a working landscape, like a farm or like a natural area in New Canaan. It has a reason for being. And what was happening, remember that soil compaction way back when, that if you have trails, we have beautiful trails in the forest, but they're not comfortable trails, what do people do? They walk off the trails, right? So when your trails, you see this picture of the trails covered with mud, in kind of mud season. You guys know all about that. We have fences along the trails there. We finally prevailed and were able to put them up. But they might hop the fence and go on the upland on either side, and they're trampling baby plants wherever they're walking. So what we did is we worked with Andrew Pogon Associates to design a trail system that is appropriate, that seems like it fits in the space, but is actually rugged and can be maintained. So it's a graded gravel that's mixed and put down and then watered in and vibrated. No stabilizers, it's just local stone. It's all local stone, but different sizes, put down and vibrated. And we put some mulch over the top in a very thin layer. And we have stone fords, like the one pictured here, where water crosses. And they've held up remarkably well through lots and lots and lots of wear and tear. We had some unfortunate interventions from previous generations. Unfortunately, we had the support to make improvements. So there's a little concrete pad that crossed an ephemeral stream in the forest. Basically, as soon as it rained, that would be underwater. So we worked with Andrew Pogon Associates to design a beautiful new bridge. Again, we want to welcome people into the forest. We want to give them proper and appropriate access so they can enjoy it. And we are studying. The key thing I would say to people who are interested in doing restoration ecology, which is what this is called, is don't think that you know what you're doing and go do it and then walk away. We are constantly monitoring the impact of our management activities. There's really no literature about how to do this correctly. There are lots of stories about restoration projects and replanting and reforestation and afforestation and meadow creation. There's not very much out there about the long-term viability of these places. So we're trying to create that data. So if people want to do this in New Canaan or in Ridgefield or anywhere else, that they have actual data-driven information, that they'll learn from our mistakes, because we make lots of mistakes. And not only have people really taken to our forest, but so a phenomenal array of animals. I have to stop every now and again and remind you, this is in the Bronx in New York City. And it is stunningly beautiful if it were in Vermont, but to the point that it's almost miraculous given where it is, its context. So then you see the fox, there's a great horned owl right there. We have really healthy populations of both two-lined and gray-backed salamanders. And those are great indicators of a healthy ecosystem. We have very clean water in our ephemeral streams. They're all the things that are great and kind of upbuilding about nature exist there on a small scale. And of course, disturbances, they keep on happening, and they've always happened in the forest. Hurricanes have been a regular part of the forest since well before Native Americans showed up here. It's just part of the deal. And so when you build a new bridge, chances are the big tree, when it falls over, is going to hit it. And just that's life. So we just roll up our sleeves, go back and fix. Post Sandy, we cleaned up the trails for the reasons that I hope are clear, for safety and access. But we left all the logs. We lost about 150 trees in the forest that were 20 inches DBH and larger. I mean, it's a monster 150-year-old oaks. And they're all there. I mean, we cleaned them up a little bit, but not excessively. The thought process being that a 175-year-old black oak has been taking up molybdenum and boron and manganese and other micronutrients from deep within the soil profile for its entire life. And if you take that wood out of this forest, remember those heavy metals, you're just pushing that soil further and further away from a set of circumstances that will promote the growth of these native species. So we're leaving that wood in as habitat, also to replenish and restore the soil. So that's the forest in the fall. It's a remarkable place with a remarkable history. It's been a lot of fun to do our work in the forest, to learn about what the human impacts have been, and to start to figure out ways to peel them back. And we hope to be inspiring to other people who love open spaces, who love nature, and who believe that people have a role in nature. Okay, so that was the forest, and I don't know, it's about 7:10, I think it looks like back there. So I also prepared a little thing about our new native plant garden that I can go through very quickly. I'm happy to stop here if you guys want to drink wine. Chris is saying, go ahead, go ahead. So he said, don't even give you the option. Yeah, exactly. So quickly, you've heard about the forest. You have all the institutional background. Nathaniel Britton, the founding director of the garden, was also an expert on the plants native to northeastern North America, as was his wife, an expert on mosses of the region. That's his wife. She learned, because of her experience with those god-awful school children in the forest, that nature should not be taken for granted, that natural ecosystems needed to be protected and species needed to be preserved. So she was an early founder of the Wildflower Preservation Society of America, which is one of the earliest conservation groups in this country, working at about the same time that John Muir was working in the West to preserve great swaths of land, but she was focused on preserving native species. We made a garden, or the garden made a garden in the 1940s in honor of her memory, in honor of her commitment to native plants, native species, and in honor of the institution's long history of studying these species. Here's a shot from that garden a few years ago. It was interesting. It was an attempt to capture regional ecosystems of note, the Pine Barrens, the Hempstead Plains, Bartholomew's Cobble, and kind of recreate them in miniature, almost like our holiday train show recreates kind of landmarks in miniature, and fill them up with really cool native plants. And I loved it when I started the garden from graduate school, because I didn't really care about how things looked. I just was really interested in the plants. But if you weren't me, you wouldn't have even stopped. It didn't look like a garden, and it certainly didn't draw you in any way, shape, or form. So that's it. That's it from above. You can see a lot of turf, kind of Eurasian species mainly, an old drainage ditch. That's the forest right there, so it's got a great setting on the edge of the forest, but not a lot to appeal to the unconverted. So we worked with Umeå van Sweden, again, because of our long history of growing and studying native plants, to create a new design for the native plant garden a few years ago. This just opened last May of 2013. And the idea behind this garden is not to recreate nature. We have that in the forest, but it is to celebrate the beauty and diversity of plants in a garden setting that could use plants from anywhere. That doesn't tell you that you should love native plants, that invites you to see them in a beautiful way, and we hope convinces you to love them, makes you fall in love with them. So it's divided into a few different sections. We have a great meadow. That is a design process. This is a garden designed to be beautiful, remember. It's not designed to echo any natural system anywhere. Umeå van Sweden, Wolfgang Umeå and Jim van Sweden kind of pioneered what's called the New American Garden style, They used huge swaths of plants, herbaceous plants and woody plants, to create kind of big impact in big spaces. And one of their proteges, a woman named Sheila Brady, who's a great artist with plants, worked closely with us. And what they did, they were the painters, and we, the botanists, kind of assembled the pigments and made the paints. We decided what plants we needed to have in the garden, and they combined them in ways that are novel. So I just wanted to talk to you guys about how this works, and you can see the impact. Taking the space, here's some kind of colors we want. These are the plants that we want to squeeze in. A great diversity of plants. There's a wet meadow down at the bottom of the hill, a mesic meadow, a ridge or a dry meadow. All of these plants, or most of these plants, were considered because they supported wildlife, butterflies or birds or insect larvae, as well as because of their beautiful flowers or foliage or texture. That was that spot for the meadow. So again, not very beautiful. It's a drainage ditch and some lawn on a slope. That is a great glacial erratic, like the one in your picture there. You'll see more of that, called Britain Rock. Of course, you bring in the heavy equipment. You push the soil around. A little aside about soil. Never has so much money been spent and so little space to make soil so bad. If you're a native plant person, you know that for meadows in particular, meadows need what it's called depauperate soil, poor soil. They need soil that's not very rich in nutrients, because the meadow plants have evolved in these very harsh environments, and the things that love lots of nutrients are the weeds that will outcompete the native meadow plants. So you have to spend lots of money to make sure your soil is crappy, so your plants are happy. And I was hugely skeptical. I said, since Egyptian times, people have been amending soil with manure to make plants grow better. This is what we do. We're gardeners. We know how to do this. I can make anything grow if you give me the proper mix of fertilizer and compost. And they said, no. Please trust me. So I did, if barely. Planted a gazillion plugs. There are different ways to plant a meadow in modern times. One is by seed. We decided that that's not certain enough. It's wonderful because it encapsulates the kind of process of succession and change. It's so great. But it's not, you often get something to start off with that you don't like that much. You kind of cross your fingers and hope that in 5 or 10 years you'll like it more. At the New York Botanical Garden, we don't have that kind of patience. So instead, we designed using plugs. And these are plants about the size of your pinky. And we planted about 100,000 plants throughout the whole garden over the course of a few years. So you can see the gardeners hard at work. And then Irene came. So this was in late August of 2011. And Irene came literally the afternoon that we completed planting the meadow. Fingers crossed, came in the next day. That's what it looked like. And actually, the plants generally held because they were in crappy soil that was well draining, because they were small. They didn't even have enough root mass to float away, and a few things were here and there. There was a little bit of disarray, but we kind of fixed it quickly. And that's the way it looked, literally, 2 days after it was planted. This was opening in May of 2013. And if you know the garden, we don't do things like and say, oh, just wait. No, I know that you came here and you paid $20 to come here. I promise you it'll be great in 5 years. We understand that people are coming to be enthralled. And so we're working this whole thing to figure out how do we create this in a way that's going to be enthralling. And I am the one who, if it works, the designers get all the credit. If it doesn't work, I get all the blame. You all understand the way that works, right? So I'm sort of, oh God, I hope these plugs work, because it doesn't look good now, and it's only a year, and it was 18 months from this point that the garden was going to open. That was it this past summer. Pretty good, right? From plugs in basically less than 24 months, in less than 2 years. And in fact, it's been so successful that even starting last summer, we're thinning and we're redoing, and nature is intervening in ways that we don't love. So it's remarkable. And the meadow has been an absolute disco nightclub, a singles club for birds. I did a lot of reading and research, and we all did, and I did a lot of talking before the fact. Birds love these plants. You plant them, the birds will come. But we didn't really have any proof of that in and around New York City. And I swear, I'm not much of a bird watcher, but the birds are a lot of fun to watch. And it's every season, it's different. because these are native plants, because many of these plants have insects that feed on them, and the birds feed those insects to their young, because they flower at different times, they have different pollen, you can actually kind of measure out the calendar based on which birds are doing what when in the middle of the Bronx. There's also a great woodland, of course. This is right at the edge of the Thane Family Forest, a great shaded spot. And so the meadow was formerly lawn, wide open, bright and sunny. This is shady. And again, just to get you a sense of the complexity that goes into creating and designing a garden, the artists design, they paint using the pigments that we mix, which are the plants that we want. The conditions are what the conditions were. So this is shady at the edge of the forest. It had been an old kind of woodland garden. Nice, but not particularly beautiful. Then you buy, again, just truckloads full of plants, and you lay out lots of flagging tape, and you try to put that vision that they have in plan view onto the ground. It's undulating and kind of unpredictable, and the soil's all different. And then again, you plant them, preferably in a driving, freezing rain. And then a few months later, this is March of 2012. This is May of 2012. And that's May of 2013. Again, the idea here is it's meant to be a beautiful garden. This is not some place in the world that we're trying to copy. This is painting with native plants that have many, many, many benefits, one of which is that they're quite beautiful. It's foam flower and trillium and dogwood. And that's in the summer. It's also planted to have multiple phases. So once all the spring ephemerals go away, there's a wonderful big swaths and sweeps of sedges and ferns that create a kind of a legible ground plane, like kind of an anti-lawn, all the way through the summer. And to my eye, it's as pretty in the middle of August as it is in May. Maybe not quite, but close. There's also a water feature at the heart of the garden. The water is all captured from the site and recirculated because, again, we were working with a drainage ditch, which basically was irrigation runoff and other water and stormwater runoff. So not the sort of thing that makes for an oppressive display. Again, we started with the plants, a variety of wetland plants, including pitcher plants, which are quite fun, and marsh mallow, or swamp mallow, a great plant. Again, we started with not the most beautiful site in the world, turf and a drainage ditch, and got lots of big equipment and pushed big piles of soil around. And that's the feature, so that's the same view as that. Again, it's all recirculating, it's biofiltered by plants. There's a lot of technologies here, a lot of approaches to landscape management that could be used for stormwater management. So that's in May, maybe April, now here's early June, late June, early July with the cardinal flowers, the Monarda, the bee balm. Again, big swaths, big impactful swaths of plants. And that's at the end of fall. So ruby-throated hummingbird, and so that was the native plant garden in about 5 minutes, which is as quickly as I've ever done it. But just hopefully it will entice you to come to visit the garden. So we'll conclude by saying thank you all for doing what you do to make your local environment better, more livable, more beautiful, more inspiring. I've committed my career to that. I do think that for kids, I have 3 kids. I grew up in suburban New Jersey. And the thing that made me happiest and that fulfills me to this day is kind of getting outside, even if it's a small space. Starting out as a kid in my backyard, which seemed like an endless wood. If I went to see it now, it's basically, probably 3 Norway maples and some beer cans. It really is an incredibly important thing that you do for your community. So thank you, and if you have any questions, I can answer some of my heart. Well, we do between 3 and 5 exhibitions each year. So we just closed the train show on Sunday. We'll start installing the orchid show, which this year is going to have a Key West contemporary theme. It'll be quite fun. That's March into April. Then our exhibition this summer is called Groundbreakers, Great American Gardens and the Women Who Designed Them, celebrating the work of Beatrix Farron, who designed our rose garden. Using as a set piece, like Monet or Darwin did, this is using the Rockefeller Garden in Seal Harbor that she designed in the 1920s. And then we'll have a display of photographs by these three amazing female photographers from the early 20th century. But most people don't realize that before women could vote in this country, there were relatively few professions open to them. One of those professions was landscape architecture, another was garden writing, another was garden photography. And so not only were these opportunities for very smart, very well-educated women to succeed, but ultimately these became fields in which they were the leading figures. So if you were a gazillionaire, you know, in the Gilded Age or just after, and you wanted to impress, you would hire Beatrix Farron or Marion Coffin or Ellen Shipman, and you know, and so it was. So we want to celebrate that tradition as we always do. And then in the landscape, we're just starting planning our maple and lilac collection restorations. We just planted the seasonal walk. Pete Adolph designed the seasonal walk for us that was just planted in November. So next year will be its first year. He originally designed this near the conservatory. We'd asked him 4 years ago, well, in 2009, to design this as part of the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson's voyage up the Hudson River for a one-year display. And he worked with a woman named Jacqueline Vanderkloot, and they did together design this wonderful border for a one-year display. And it was so popular, we left it for 4 years. So we finally gave him the chance to actually design a garden that's meant to be somewhat permanent. And the list goes on and on and on and on. So, yes.
What if you could talk just for a minute about how the garden approaches exotic versus natives? You've got these wonderful Asian trees that you showed us at the beginning. Would you take those trees in now? At what point do you get rid of the exotics? How do you evaluate the process?
That is a great question. Do I need this? Can you all hear me if I don't?
No, it's better, I like it better when you keep it close.
Okay. Okay. That's a great question. And just from a biological sense, a very, very small percentage of non-native species become invasive species. Those that do are quite well adapted and sort of frightening. We now, anytime we add an unknown species to our collection, we'll screen it for potential invasiveness. Is it bird dispersed? Does it grow in disturbed sites? Does it have what's called wide ecological amplitude, meaning it can grow in shade or sun like cork tree? So we'll look at those things, and if the answer to those questions is yes, we likely will not include it outside in our living collections. Or we might plant it in a small way in a nursery and watch how it behaves over time. And that's relatively new. That's over the past decade. Things that are existing in the collections, we are phasing out. So I'm not going, I still have cork trees left in our living collections. They're very important historic trees. I don't have the heart to cut them down. I know that I can manage them going forward in the forest because we've just gone through this whole exercise. So I'm not that worried about them. But when they die, which all trees do eventually, I will not replace them with cork trees. And I, as a gardener, I'm a gardener and a nature person. There's definitely room for both. And the traditions of gardening are very important. And the traditions of going around the world and being inspired by plants is very important. And we celebrate them at the garden as we do nature. Any other questions? Two more. Go ahead.
What about chestnut trees? What's happening with them?
Oh, isn't that funny? Did anyone read the New York Times op-ed about this not too long ago? Again, chestnut blight was discovered at the zoo next to the garden and described by a garden botanist. And chestnuts were an important component of the forest 100 years ago. There were a few of those wonderful kind of dying stump sprouts that we've all seen in woods around here. When I started at the garden 15 years ago, they're actually gone now. They're just petered out, which they do. when we started the forest restoration, we wanted to try chestnut again in the forest, but we only wanted to try American chestnut. And there are sources for American chestnut seed. This is pure American chestnut, not the hybrid or not the GMO. So we worked with the American Chestnut Foundation, who was able to source for us American chestnut seed collected from a tree that is not infected from actually a zone far away from infection, and grew those on and planted a handful of kind of ceremonial ones in the forest. We know that they will get the blight and they will die, but it was sort of fun. It's a handful, we'll see how it goes. In order to get those seeds, they asked if we would be willing to plant the hybrids, which I was very much so in the collections, and if we'd be willing to plant these GMO chestnuts. We as an institution have a pretty open mind about GMOs. I mean, we're scientists. We understand the process we study gene expression in plants, so we get this. However, we also understand the risks posed by genetically modified organisms. So we went through this thought process. We don't have any others that I'm aware of in the garden. I've never included them. What's the risk of planting GMO chestnuts? Well, the big risk would be polluting the chestnut genome, the wild chestnut genome, which we all know no longer exists. It doesn't exist in the garden, believe me. There's not a single chestnut anywhere within wind pollination of the garden. There's just not. So they planted 10 of them at the garden in a kind of an experimental grid, and we're going to watch them and see how they perform. I personally do not think that GMOs are it doesn't make any sense to me why you would plant lots of GMOs to try to reestablish chestnut, because basically all you're planting is something that can't reproduce on its own, so you're doing a one-time thing and you're committing to long-term planting something. And if I've learned anything in our work in the forest, is the best use of your time is to try to gently persuade nature to heal itself. And if you are committed to doing something specifically, you are almost 100% certain to fail. Right, so that's why I said, if our forest ends up being all black cherry and sweet birch, which it may well be, because those are native species that are really thriving right now, then as long as it's not all cork tree and knotweed. So that's the answer. Does that answer your question? There was one more question over here. No?
Animal species that you have to control?
Well, I would love to shoot a lot of animals at the garden, to tell you the truth, but it's very impolitic. The rabbits, oh my God, the rabbits, and the squirrels, oh God, the rabbits and the squirrels and the chipmunks, they are off the charts. We don't have deer. Yeah, we're fortunate. There have been the occasional deer working its way through. They come down the Bronx River corridor, which connects us to Westchester County. We have wild turkeys, and we have 2 of them, and so they're kind of nice for visitors to see, but they're not a problem yet. But the rabbits, we have coyotes as of only a few years ago. We started to see a coyote from time to time. Now we think there might be one denning there, which I'm thrilled about, because what do coyotes eat? Rabbits and squirrels, so we'll see. So animals, we don't really do anything about them except for, in a winter when it doesn't freeze, between the squirrels and chipmunks, we'll lose 95% of the bulbs you plant. I mean, you have to plant literally twice the number of bulbs that you think you need in order to get the number of bulbs that you want.
Aren't you bothered with cats?
No, occasionally there are stray cats that work their way down to the garden, and well-meaning staff sometimes will, give them little saucers of water or whatever. No, nor dogs. There's great stories. Oh my God, there have been people at the garden for 50 years who'll tell you stories about in the 1960s when, crazy Fordham people were doing acid and lighting trees on fire. I don't really believe many of those stories. But certainly it was a different place back then. So that might have been overrun by feral cats and feral dogs in the 60s, but not anymore. Anybody else?
Do you see any black knot on your cherries?
Oh, yeah. Again, in the forest, there's absolutely nothing. What we've seen is that it's actually spreading a little bit to our ornamental cherries, not all of, we have a lot of really amazing Japanese flowering cherries, and it shows up from time to time on some cultivars. We have a great cherry from Asia called Prunus Sogdiana. It's right by the Masu Gate, one of our entrances. It's a very rare flowering cherry, and it has black knot. And we'll cut it out of that tree in the living collection from time to time, but it's just, you know, it's kind of it's there all the time. We do practice integrated pest management, and if we see that a pest or disease is going to wipe something out, we'll control it using the best measures. It might be cultural, it might be chemical, but black knot we don't. Sorry, is that it? That's it. I'm being kicked off.
I'm going to ask you to sit.
Okay.
Let me come over to this side so I can present this.
Okay.
Two quick points. One is I was going to tell Todd that one of the activities the Land Trust will do this year is sponsor a trip to the New York Botanical Garden. So
That's that miscellaneous time you saw right there.
that's the good news. It was going to be one, but now I realize we probably have to go twice to get a good feel for how the garden changes spring and fall. The second point, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, is that I went to school for 4 years across the street from the Botanical Garden. I was one of the crazy Fordham prep kids. Yeah. And when I couldn't sneak over to the pool hall, I would sneak into the Botanical Garden. So I appreciate that. I will say this. If I could have a big brother as a Land Trust president, it would be Todd Forrest. If you want to know what a long-term possible vision for part of the New Canaan Land Trust might be, it could be something along these lines in a smaller scale. But remember, there are 365 acres in New Canaan and more potentially to add to it. There's 250 acres contiguous in the Bronx. So we have opportunities for experimentation here. That said, I have 3 gifts for you. Homemade jam from Penny Ross.
Whiskey, but that's all right.
No, we can get that later. This is homemade maple syrup from Haikavukian Sugar Shack.
Oh, wonderful. These are local products.
Local products, and then for your book collection, one is the 25th edition of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and the other is the Book of Quotes from John Muir.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Those are
Very
generous.
happy to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll adjourn now, and there are hors d'oeuvres, drinks. Please socialize, mingle, chat with us, chat with any of the board members you see. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you for your support. That was great. Super. What a good story. My heart soars when I take a look at what you did with the plants and the gardens. Can I introduce Rich Giamatti? He's president of the Stamp Institute.